My name is Kiara. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. My parents waited until my birthday party to say what they had hidden for years. My father raised his voice and said, "You deserve to know we never loved you." My mother looked away and murmured, "You should have realized that years ago." Every face turned toward me. I stood up, smiled, and said, "That explains everything." Then I walked out. The next morning they had called 88 times. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling mansion, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my 32nd birthday. Instead, the grand foyer of our family estate was packed with my father Desmond's mayoral campaign donors. Waiters dressed in crisp white shirts and black bow ties circulated gracefully with silver trays of incredibly expensive champagne, while a live jazz quartet played softly in the background. Absolutely no one in this house was here for me tonight. They were only here to write massive checks to keep the Sterling family name in absolute power. I stood near the massive marble staircase, trying to blend into the shadows. My dark skin and simple conservative black dress stood out starkly against the sea of sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos worn by the Atlanta black elite. I am a forensic auditor. I spend my days tracing hidden assets and unraveling financial fraud. I prefer the quiet logic of numbers to the loud superficiality of high society. My father Desmond operates differently. He thrives on optics control and absolute loyalty. I watched him shake hands with a prominent judge, his charismatic smile firmly in place. But the moment his eyes locked onto mine, the warmth vanished. He excused himself from the judge and marched across the foyer toward me. His heavy footsteps echoed slightly over the smooth jazz music. Before I could even offer a greeting, he grabbed my arm with a crushing grip and pulled me into the dim hallway near his private study. "Sign this," he demanded, shoving a thick, leather-bound folder into my chest. I stumbled back slightly, catching the folder before it hit the floor. I opened the cover. The heading across the top read, "Trust Fund Management Transfer and Full Power of Attorney." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained an impassive mask. Years of surviving in this house had taught me never to show fear. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady and completely flat. Desmond adjusted his silk tie, refusing to look me in the eye. "It is a standard authorization form. You are turning 32 tonight. The blind trust your late aunt set up for you requires a management transition. You are far too busy with your little accounting job, and frankly, you lack the business acumen to handle the Sterling family assets. I am having the legal control permanently transferred to my campaign holding company. It relieves you of the burden. Now find a pen and sign the damn paper before my major donors notice I am missing." I read the fine print. It was not a management transition. It was a complete surrender of my inheritance effective at midnight. Once I signed, I would have zero legal right to the trust. He was trying to steal my entire future under the guise of a birthday favor. "I am not signing this," I said, closing the folder and handing it back to him. "I am a forensic auditor, Dad. I read contracts for a living. I know exactly what this document means, and I am fully capable of managing my own finances." Desmond turned a dark shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed, stepping so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You live in my house. You eat my food. You owe everything to the Sterling name." Before he could escalate further, the sharp click of stiletto heels broke the tension. My younger sister Chantel sauntered into the hallway, followed closely by her husband Darius. Chantel was the golden child. At 29, she was a lifestyle influencer who spent her days taking photos in private jets funded by our parents. She wore a custom couture red gown that sparkled under the crystal sconces. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves. Beside her, Darius wore a velvet blazer playing the role of the visionary tech billionaire. Is there a problem here? Chantel asked, her voice dripping with condescension. She looked me up and down, a familiar smirk playing on her lips. Honestly, Kiara, you could have put in a little effort for Dad's big night. Did you buy that dress at a thrift store? You always struggle so hard to fit in with the family standards. It is actually embarrassing. I stared at her. The dress she was wearing cost more than my first car, and I knew exactly which of my credit cards she had stolen to pay for it. But I kept my mouth shut. I was busy gathering federal evidence, not picking meaningless petty fights. Darius chuckled, swirling his glass of bourbon. Leave her alone, babe. Kiara is just tired from counting other people's pennies all day. Being a glorified calculator for rich people must be exhausting. He leaned against the wall, projecting an air of absolute arrogance. You should let Desmond handle the adult money, Kiara. My new tech startup is about to go public. Dad just invested heavily into my seed round. If you sign the paper, maybe I will throw a few stock options your way. To help you move out of that cheap studio apartment you rent. I looked at Darius, noting the smug expression plastered across his face. I knew the truth about his startup. I had spent the last 3 months quietly auditing his company on behalf of a federal task force. There was absolutely no code. There was absolutely no app. Darius was laundering money for underground gambling rings in South Atlanta, and he was using my mother's charity foundation as a shell company to do it. But he did not know I knew that. None of them did. I do not need your stock options, Darius, I replied calmly. And I do not need anyone to manage my trust fund. Chantel rolled her eyes aggressively. God, you are so selfish. Dad is trying to become the mayor of Atlanta and you are being stubborn over a piece of paper. You have always been jealous of me. Jealous of my marriage, jealous of my life, jealous that Mom and Dad actually like me. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. As she moved, she dramatically threw her hands up in frustration. The full glass of red wine in her hand tipped forward. A dark crimson stain splashed across the front of my black dress, soaking through the fabric and leaving a freezing, sticky mess against my skin. Oops, Chantel said loudly. Her voice carried out into the foyer, drawing the attention of several guests. My hand slipped. I stood there humiliated. A heavy silence fell over the hallway. The jazz music seemed to fade away. Several prominent politicians and campaign donors turned to watch the spectacle. No one offered me a napkin. No one asked if I was all right. I looked at my mother, Yvonne, who had just walked over to investigate the commotion. She was draped in diamonds and pearls. She took one look at my stained dress and sighed in deep disgust, shaking her head as if I had intentionally ruined the evening. Desmond had finally had enough. He saw his perfect political image cracking. He grabbed the microphone from the podium set up in the main hall. He did not care who was listening anymore. His rage overtook his political sense. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. I told you to sign the paper, he yelled, his voice booming through the speakers. You have no right to refuse me. You deserve to know the truth. We never loved you. The entire mansion gasped in unison. Yvonne refused to meet my eyes. She looked away and murmured, You should have realized that years ago. You are nothing but an embarrassment. Every face in the room turned toward me, waiting for me to break down, cry or scream. Instead, I stood up, tall, looked around the room, smiled, and said, Well, that explains absolutely everything. I adjusted my posture completely, ignoring the heavy, suffocating silence of the crowd, and calmly walked right out the large front double doors into the freezing night air. The cold Atlanta night air hit my face like a much-needed shock to the system as I descended the grand stone steps of the Sterling mansion. I did not look back. I did not call a rideshare right away. I just walked down the long, manicured driveway, my ruined dress clinging to me, the fake diamonds left behind on the marble floor. I felt lighter than I had in 32 years. I reached the massive iron gates of the estate and finally pulled out my phone. I requested a private black car service. When the sleek SUV pulled up, the driver took one look at my stained dress and said nothing. I gave him an address in Midtown Atlanta. It was not the address of the cheap studio my family thought I rented. It was the address of the Paramount Tower, one of the most exclusive high-rises in the city. The private elevator opened directly into my penthouse. I walked across the dark hardwood floors, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the quiet luxury, and the panoramic view of the city skyline. I had purchased this $4 million property 2 years ago, using the legitimate income from my forensic auditing firm. I was one of the most sought-after financial investigators on the East Coast, charging massive retainer fees to billionaires and corporations. My family never bothered to ask about my career beyond using it as a punchline. I stood by the window overlooking the city and watched the digital clock on my kitchen island. 11:59. Then midnight. Happy birthday to me. At that exact second, the restrictive covenants on my late aunt's blind trust evaporated. My aunt, my mother's older sister, had built an empire in commercial real estate. She saw right through my father's charming political facade and knew my mother was too obsessed with high society to manage money responsibly. When she passed away, she left everything to me. But because I was only a teenager at the time, my father was appointed as the custodial manager until my 32nd birthday. He spent the last decade treating my inheritance like his personal piggy bank, funding his political campaigns, buying my mother's diamonds, and propping up my brother-in-law's fake businesses. The document he tried to force me to sign at the party was a desperate attempt to maintain that control forever. Every bank account, every property deed, every investment portfolio associated with the Sterling name officially transferred into my sole legal custody at midnight. I did not just freeze their assets. I reclaimed what was already mine. I woke up at 6 in the morning feeling completely refreshed. I walked into my pristine kitchen and turned on the espresso machine. I picked up my phone from the marble counter. The screen lit up with an absurd number of notifications, 88 missed calls. The panic had started early. The first call came at 12:15 from my father. He must have tried to use a corporate account to pay the catering staff at the mansion, only to find it locked. By 1 in the morning, the family lawyer had called 12 times. By 3 in the morning, my mother and sister had joined the barrage. Their texts shifted from arrogant demands to confused anger, and finally to pure desperation. Kiara, answer the phone. Kiara, what did you do to the bank accounts? Kiara, call us right now. I took a slow sip of my dark espresso. Right on cue, the phone vibrated in my hand. It was the 89th call. The caller ID flashed Darius. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. Kiara. What the hell is going on? Darius was not using his smooth, arrogant tech billionaire voice anymore. He sounded like a cornered animal breathing heavily into the receiver. I am at the bank right now, and the branch manager is telling me my accounts are locked under a federal hold. My black card was declined at the club last night. Did you do this? Did you hack my accounts? I leaned against the counter and smiled. I do not hack Darius. I audit. I am a federally licensed forensic investigator. And as of midnight, I am also the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust, the trust that your so-called tech startup has been heavily borrowing from. What are you talking about? He yelled, his voice cracking. Your dad invested his own money into my seed round. My dad does not have his own money, I corrected him calmly. He has my money. Or rather, he had my money. Now the federal government is reviewing exactly where every single dollar went. I am off the clock, Darius. Call your lawyer. I hung up the phone and set it back down on the counter. The silence in my penthouse was beautiful, but I knew it would not last. Desperate people do reckless things. 2 hours later, the building concierge called up to my unit. He sounded incredibly nervous. Miss Sterling, I am so sorry to disturb you, but there are 2 individuals in the lobby demanding to see you. They slipped past the security gate when another resident was leaving. They claim to be your sister and brother-in-law. Should I call the police? I thought about it for a second. No, I replied. Send them up. I want to see them. I unlocked the private elevator access. A few minutes later, the heavy steel doors opened directly into my living room. Chantel and Darius stepped out. For a moment, all of their anger seemed to evaporate, replaced by absolute shock. Chantel stared at the vaulted ceilings, the original artwork on the walls, and the sweeping view of Atlanta. "What is this place?" Chantel asked, her voice dropping to a confused whisper. "Whose apartment is this?" "It is mine," I said, walking out from the kitchen holding my tablet. "I bought it 2 years ago." Chantel snapped out of her trance. Her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She marched across the hardwood floor, her expensive heels clicking loudly. "You thief!" she screamed. "You used the family money to buy this place. You stole from us while pretending to be broke. You are sick. You are actually mentally sick." She reached out and tried to grab my arm, raising her hand as if she was going to slap me. I caught her wrist in midair. My grip was like iron. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, my voice low and dangerous. I pushed her hand away. "And for the record, Chantel, I bought this place with money I earned from my firm. You are the only thief standing in this room." She stumbled back, clutching her wrist. "What are you talking about?" I pointed at the luxury designer bag hanging from her shoulder. "The $30,000 handbag you are holding. The $3,000 custom hair extensions on your head. The matching diamond tennis bracelets. You bought all of those last month using a Black American Express card. A card that was legally issued in my name, which our mother gave you access to without my permission." Chantel opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. "I reported that card stolen at exactly 12:01 this morning," I continued, my voice perfectly steady. "The credit card company is currently investigating the fraudulent charges. You might want to hold on to that bag, Chantel. You are going to need to sell it to pay your legal fees." Darius stepped forward, puffing out his chest to look intimidating. "Listen to me, you crazy witch. I do not care about some stupid designer bags. You need to call the bank right now and lift the hold on my business accounts. I have an initial public offering in 2 weeks. You are ruining a billion-dollar tech company because you are having a jealous temper tantrum." I could not help it. I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the large room. "A tech company?" I asked, tapping the screen of my tablet. I swiped a few times and mirrored the display to the massive television mounted on the living room wall. Complex financial spreadsheets and banking records suddenly illuminated the screen in bright red and white graphics. Darius squinted at the television. "What is that?" "That is the reality of your revolutionary startup, Darius." I walked closer to the screen. "Over the past 3 months, I conducted a full forensic sweep of your business on behalf of the Securities and Exchange Commission. There is no code. There is no app. You do not even have a software development team." Darius went completely pale. His arrogant posture collapsed instantly. "You set up a fake corporate entity," I explained, reading the numbers off the screen. "You used my father's campaign funds and my mother's charity foundation as shell companies. You took millions of dollars from those accounts and funneled the money into underground sports betting rings in South Atlanta. You are not a tech billionaire. You are a low-level money launderer for illegal gambling syndicates." Chantel slowly turned to look at her husband. Her eyes were wide with horror. "Darius, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying." Darius could not speak. He was staring at the television screen, watching his entire criminal enterprise laid out in perfect, undeniable mathematical clarity. The encrypted ledgers, the offshore transfers, the dummy vendor payments. I had found every single penny. "You did not just steal from the family trust," I said, turning back to face them. "You defrauded federal banks. You misused a registered nonprofit charity. And you did it all leaving a digital paper trail so sloppy a first-year accounting student could have caught you." "Please," Darius whispered, his voice trembling. "Kiara, please. You cannot give this to the authorities. They will lock me away for decades," Chantel tell her. "We are family." Chantel suddenly burst into tears. She grabbed my arm again, completely forgetting her anger from a few minutes ago. "Kiara, you cannot do this. You cannot send my husband to prison. What about my reputation? What about the family name? You have to delete those files. We will pay you back. We will give you whatever you want." I looked at my younger sister. For the first time in my life, she was looking at me with genuine respect. Not out of love, but out of absolute terror. She finally realized that I held her entire existence in the palm of my hand. I looked down at my watch. "It is too late for that," I said. I already submitted the final audit report to the federal task force 3 days ago. The hold on your accounts was just the first step. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up my empty espresso cup. I took it to the sink and rinsed it out slowly, letting the water run while they stood there in shocked silence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not like to wait when millions of dollars in charity fraud are involved, I said over the sound of the running water. I turned off the tap and dried my hands on a fresh towel. In fact, based on the timeline my contacts at the Bureau gave me, federal agents are raiding your downtown office in exactly 4 minutes. Darius let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. It was already ringing. The caller ID showed his office building security desk. You might want to beat the morning traffic, I said, walking to the private elevator and pressing the call button. The doors slid open immediately. I gestured toward the empty car. And do not ever come to my home again. Darius stumbled into the elevator without looking back. Chantel hesitated for a second, staring at me as if I was a stranger she had never met before. Then she ran in after him, sobbing uncontrollably. The steel doors slid shut, sealing them inside and returning my penthouse to its perfect, peaceful silence. The first wave of the Sterling family collapse had officially begun. But I knew my parents would not surrender this easily. My parents were not the type of people to surrender gracefully. They had spent decades building an impenetrable fortress of political power and social influence in Atlanta, and they were willing to burn everything to the ground to protect it. By noon that same day, my father's political machine roared to life. I sat in my penthouse watching the local news channels and monitoring the prominent Atlanta gossip blogs. There was not a single mention of Darius being raided by federal agents. Desmond had called in every political favor he had with the local police precinct and media executives to suppress the story completely. Instead, a brand new headline began trending across social media. The anonymous leak claimed that the estranged daughter of mayoral candidate Desmond Sterling had suffered a severe psychological breakdown. The article painted me as a bitter, unstable woman who was desperately trying to extort her wealthy parents to fund a lavish lifestyle. They even hired a luxury crisis public relations firm to release a statement expressing my parents' deep sorrow over my declining mental health. It was a masterful, vicious spin designed to destroy my credibility before I could ever tell the truth. Then came the professional attack. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I received a formal email from the managing partner at my auditing firm. Attached was a legal notice from the State Board of Accountancy. Desmond had filed an emergency injunction against me, accusing me of severe ethical violations, breach of fiduciary duty, and extortion. He claimed I had illegally accessed family financial records during a mental health crisis. Because of the sheer political weight of my father's name, the board had no choice but to open an immediate investigation. My firm placed me on an indefinite, unpaid administrative leave. My access to the firm's servers was revoked. My keycard was deactivated. Desmond was trying to cut off my professional credibility so that when I spoke out about the stolen trust fund, no one would believe me. He wanted to isolate me completely. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from my mother, Yvonne. It read, "Meet me at the Oakmont Country Club, 3 o'clock. Let us end this before you embarrass yourself further." I changed into a sharp, tailored navy blue suit and drove to the Oakmont Country Club. It was the absolute crown jewel of Atlanta's black elite, an exclusive sanctuary where multi-million-dollar business deals were struck, over 18 holes of golf, and endless glasses of expensive champagne. The parking lot was filled with imported luxury vehicles. I walked through the grand mahogany doors and was immediately escorted by a hostess to the private outdoor patio. Yvonne was sitting at a shaded corner table overlooking the meticulously manicured golf course. She was dressed in pristine white silk, looking every bit the elegant, long-suffering socialite matriarch. When she saw me approaching, her entire demeanor shifted for an audience. For the benefit of the wealthy onlookers sitting at the adjacent tables, she stood up and offered me a warm, tragic smile. She reached out and pulled me into a tight embrace. To anyone watching, it looked like a beautiful, touching picture of a mother forgiving her deeply troubled daughter. But as she pressed her cheek against mine, her voice dropped into a venomous, hateful whisper. "You have lost your mind, Kiara. You really thought you could outsmart us. Sit down and keep your voice low. I pulled away from her embrace, keeping my face perfectly neutral, and sat across from her. A waiter immediately appeared and poured me a glass of sparkling water. I waited for him to walk away before I spoke. "How is Darius holding up?" I asked casually, taking a sip of the water. I imagine the federal holding cell is not quite as comfortable as his luxury corner office. Yvonne waved her hand dismissively, as if a federal raid was nothing more than a minor scheduling conflict. Desmond is handling the Darius situation. He has already secured the absolute best defense attorney in the state. Darius will not spend a single night in a cell. You, on the other hand, are completely out of options. You are suspended from your job. Your professional reputation is ruined. The entire city thinks you are clinically insane. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on the edge of the glass table. You were always too dark, too quiet, and too stubborn to survive in our world, Kiara. You lack the grace and the intelligence to play this game. You will never beat the sterling name in this town. Desmond owns the judges. He owns the police chief. He owns the media. You have absolutely nothing. You have... Yvonne reached into her white designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, heavy envelope. She slid it across the glass table toward me. Inside is a cashier's check for $1 million. Take it. Move to California or New York or wherever people like you go. Drop the federal holds on the family accounts and sign the trust transfer documents. If you do this today, Desmond will quietly withdraw his complaint with the accounting board. We will issue a public statement saying you are seeking private medical treatment, and we will never speak to you again. Take the money and walk away, Kiara. You are embarrassing the family. I looked down at the envelope. $1 million. It was a pathetic fraction of what they had stolen from me over the last decade. They had used my inheritance to build their entire empire, to buy their social status, and to fund Chantel's lavish lifestyle. Now they were trying to buy me off with pocket change. I did not touch the envelope. Instead, I reached into my suit jacket pocket, pulled out a cheap disposable prepaid cell phone, and placed it on the table right next to her envelope. Yvonne stared at the plastic phone. "What is this? Are you trying to record me?" I leaned in, resting my arms on the table, and mirrored her posture. I smiled. A genuine, terrifying smile. "You really think I acted alone, Yvonne? You think I woke up on my birthday, threw a temper tantrum, and hacked into a bank? I am a federal forensic auditor. I do not play political games. I deal in absolute, undeniable facts." Yvonne scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Your little auditing license is suspended, remember? You have no power here." "I did not freeze your accounts," I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical tone. "I do not have the authority to place a federal hold on a mayoral candidate's bank accounts. The Internal Revenue Service did that. The Securities and Exchange Commission did that. And they did it based on a 400-page dossier I submitted to a federal financial task force 3 months ago." The color began to drain from Yvonne's face. Her confident posture stiffened. "What dossier?" "The one detailing exactly how you and Desmond have been siphoning money from my blind trust for the last 10 years, I explained slowly, making sure every single word landed with maximum impact. "The dossier that proves Desmond took $3 million from my trust to fund his political action committee. The dossier that proves you have been using your nonprofit charity foundation as a shell company to wash the illegal gambling money Darius brings in. Every wire transfer, every forged signature, every offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I gave them everything, Yvonne." She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were visibly trembling against the table. "You are lying. Desmond would have known. Our accountants would have warned us. We have connections at the highest levels of the state government." "Your state political connections cannot stop a federal indictment," I said. "You and Desmond built a beautiful house of cards, but you funded it entirely with stolen money. My money. And the moment the clock struck midnight last night, the trust became legally mine. Which means every single asset purchased with those funds belongs to me. This elite country club membership you are so proud of, the massive mansion in Buckhead, the campaign funds, I own all of it." Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but she was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, jarring ringtone of the disposable phone I had placed on the table. I nodded toward the phone. "You should answer that. I gave this direct number to your charity director this morning just in case she needed to reach you in an emergency." Yvonne stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. She slowly reached out, picked it up with a shaking hand and pressed it to her ear. "Hello." Even from across the table I could hear the sheer panic in the charity director's voice. She was screaming so loudly that the audio distorted through the small speaker. "Yvonne, you need to get down here right now. There are unmarked vans surrounding the building. Dozens of federal agents are inside the headquarters. They have a warrant. They are carrying out boxes of our financial records and seizing the computer servers. They just handcuffed the chief financial officer." "Yvonne, what is happening?" Yvonne did not reply. She could not speak. Her perfectly manicured fingers went entirely limp. The disposable phone slipped from her grasp and clattered loudly against the glass table. At the exact same moment, her elbow knocked into her crystal champagne glass. The glass tipped over, shattering onto the stone patio and spilling expensive champagne all over her pristine white silk outfit. Several wealthy country club members at the neighboring tables turned their heads, staring in shock at the sudden mess and Yvonne's pale, terrified expression. The perfect socialite facade she had carefully maintained for decades was crumbling in real time right in front of her peers. I stood up from the table and buttoned my suit jacket. I looked down at the $1 million check still sitting inside the envelope. "Keep the money, Yvonne," I said quietly, making sure only she could hear me over the whispers of the shocked onlookers. "You are going to need every single penny to pay for your criminal defense lawyer. Have a wonderful afternoon." I turned my back on my mother and walked away, leaving her sitting in a puddle of shattered glass and spilled champagne. The second wave of the collapse had just crashed over them, and the best part was that the worst was still yet to come. I stepped into the valet area of the Oakmont Country Club and handed my ticket to the attendant. He brought my car around with practiced efficiency, and I slid into the leather driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror. I pulled out onto the main road, leaving the sprawling, exclusive golf course behind me. My phone remained blissfully silent on the passenger seat. Yvonne was undoubtedly too busy dealing with the sudden federal raid on her charity foundation headquarters to send me any more empty threats or desperate bribes. As I navigated through the heavy Atlanta afternoon traffic toward Midtown, I mentally reviewed my forensic checklist. The massive family trust was permanently secured under my name. The illicit funding funnel to my father's mayoral campaign was completely frozen. The charity shell company was currently being systematically dismantled by federal agents who were seizing every hard drive and paper ledger in the building. But there was one dangerous loose end that I knew would inevitably try to forcefully tie itself back together. Chantel and Darius. They were incredibly arrogant, but they were not entirely stupid. When their primary source of stolen wealth dried up without warning, I knew they would hunt for the person holding the faucet. I pulled into the highly secure private underground parking garage of the Paramount Tower. The thick concrete walls echoed with the low hum of my engine as I parked in my reserved spot next to a row of imported sports cars. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked toward the private resident elevators. The glass doors slid open smoothly, bringing me up to the expansive, opulent main lobby of my building. The Paramount Tower lobby was a masterpiece of modern architectural luxury. It featured imported Italian marble floors, towering cascading water features that masked the sounds of the city, and an intricate massive glass chandelier that stretched across the entire vaulted ceiling. It was a space designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy, a demographic my family always pretended to be part of, but could only access by stealing my inheritance. As I stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the mahogany concierge desk to check my afternoon mail, I noticed the head security guard, Marcus, looking incredibly stressed. He was speaking frantically into his radio headset. Before he could even step forward to warn me, two figures stepped out from the shadows behind a massive marble pillar near the resident lounge area. It was Chantel and Darius. They looked absolutely nothing like the polished, untouchable socialites who had mocked me at the birthday party less than 24 hours ago. Darius was sweating profusely through a wrinkled designer dress shirt, his signature expensive velvet blazer nowhere to be seen. His eyes were bloodshot and darting around the expansive lobby with paranoid, erratic energy. Chantel looked even worse. Her perfectly styled, expensive hair was completely disheveled and dark mascara had smudged heavily beneath her eyes, tracing the paths of recent tears. They had clearly bypassed the outer security gates, most likely by sneaking into the parking garage behind a delivery truck or aggressively bribing a new valet attendant. As soon as Chantel saw me walking across the marble floor, her eyes widened as she took in the sheer wealth of the building around us. She looked at the cascading water feature, the high-end concierge service desk, the private security detail, and then back at my perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a rabid, entirely irrational anger. The cognitive dissonance of seeing her supposedly pathetic sister living in a building she could never afford was too much for her fragile ego to process. "You live here!" Chantel shrieked, her high-pitched voice echoing loudly off the marble walls and drawing the immediate annoyed attention of several wealthy residents sitting in the lounge. "Are you kidding me? You live in the Paramount Tower!" I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the lobby, tightly clutching the handle of my briefcase. "You are trespassing on private property, Chantel." "You are a thief!" she screamed, taking a highly aggressive, threatening step toward me. "You have been pretending to be some struggling, pathetic accountant this whole entire time while you were secretly embezzling our family money. You stole from us to buy a luxury apartment. You drained the family trust fund to live like a billionaire while you let our father face total financial ruin right before his election." "Keep your voice down," Darius hissed at her, grabbing her shoulder roughly. Though he told her to be quiet, he looked equally furious and desperate. He turned his bloodshot, exhausted eyes toward me. "Kiara, you need to fix this right now. The feds tore my downtown office apart this morning. They seized all of my computer servers. They took my encrypted ledgers. I had to empty my personal home safe just to pay a criminal defense lawyer a massive cash retainer fee to keep me out of a federal holding cell for the afternoon. You are going to transfer the funds back into my startup account right this second, or I am going straight to the police to report you for corporate sabotage and grand larceny." "You cannot go to the police, Darius," I said calmly, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any fear or emotion. "Because if you walk into a police station, the desk sergeant will arrest you on the spot for running an illegal gambling syndicate. I am not embezzling anything. I am legally reclaiming what belongs to me." Chantel completely lost what little emotional composure she had left. The harsh reality that her lavish influencer lifestyle was rapidly evaporating drove her completely over the edge. She lunged forward, her face twisted in a hateful, ugly snarl. "You are just a jealous spinster," she yelled at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the building security guards who were now rushing across the lobby toward us. "You have always been incredibly jealous of me. You are a miserable, lonely woman who could never get a man to love you, so you are trying to ruin my perfect marriage. You are trying to destroy everything I have built because you are completely empty inside, and you want me to be just as miserable as you are." She reached out violently with her manicured hands and forcefully grabbed my left arm. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into the expensive fabric of my suit jacket. She tried to yank me forward to physically intimidate me, screaming her insults right into my face. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not show her a single ounce of the weakness she desperately wanted to see. Instead, I raised my right hand and slapped her grip away with a sharp, resounding smack that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet, luxurious lobby. The sheer force and suddenness of my physical counterstrike caused her to stumble backward in absolute shock. She gasped loudly, clutching her stinging red hand against her chest as if I had burned her. "Do not ever touch me again," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that made even Darius take a frightened step back. I pointed a firm finger directly at her chest, ensuring every resident and security guard in the room heard my next words. "And, for the record, Chantel, the $3,000 custom hair extensions currently attached to your head and the Hermes Birkin bag hanging on your arm were bought with a platinum credit card registered solely in my name. I formally reported that card stolen at exactly midnight last night. You are standing in my residential building wearing my stolen money and threatening me in public. You have absolutely nothing that you actually built yourself. You are a complete fraud. Chantel turned violently pale, the blood completely drained from her face. She looked down at the luxury leather handbag resting on her arm as if it had suddenly caught fire. The grand illusion of herself made success was completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. She opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but no sound came out. She was entirely suffocated by the heavy weight of the truth. Marcus, the head of security, finally reached us, flanked by two other large, heavily muscled, uniformed guards. Miss Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry about this breach. These two slipped past the loading dock gates while a moving truck was entering. Do you want me to call the Atlanta Police Department to have them formally arrested for criminal trespassing and physical assault? I looked at Chantel, who was now trembling uncontrollably, and Darius, who looked like his heart was about to give out. No, Marcus, I said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of my jacket. Just escort them off the private property immediately. Do not let them back inside under any circumstances. They have much bigger problems to worry about than a minor trespassing charge. As the security guard stepped forward and firmly grabbed Darius by the shoulders to forcefully turn him toward the exit, I took one final deliberate step closer to my brother-in-law. By the way, Darius, I said, ensuring my sharp words cut cleanly through the cloud of panic consuming his mind. The federal agents who raided your office this morning were just gathering the physical evidence for the prosecution. The actual formal indictment comes from the top down. You might want to check your email right now. Specifically, look for a secure, encrypted message from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Darius instantly stopped struggling against the strong grip of the security guards. He frantically reached into his tailored slacks with his free hand and pulled out his expensive smartphone. His trembling fingers swiped aggressively across the glass screen, opening his encrypted corporate email application. I stood there and watched the exact moment his entire life officially ended. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking like gray ash. His eyes went wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as he read the subject line of the top email. The phone slipped entirely from his sweaty grip. It plummeted to the ground, crashing onto the hard marble floor and completely shattering the glass screen into a spiderweb of cracks. The Securities and Exchange Commission had just formally charged him with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated money laundering, and operating an unlicensed financial entity. He was no longer a tech billionaire. He was a federal criminal looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Chantel finally broke down and began to sob hysterically, her loud cries echoing pathetically as the security guards physically dragged them both toward the heavy revolving glass doors. I stood firmly in the center of the opulent lobby, smoothing out the sleeve of my suit jacket, and watched them get thrown out onto the bustling, unforgiving Atlanta street. The heavy, gold-trimmed revolving doors spun to a halt, sealing the cool, climate-controlled air of the Paramount Tower away from the suffocating midday humidity outside. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I could see the immediate aftermath of their absolute ruin. Chantel had collapsed onto a concrete city bench, weeping into her hands, completely oblivious to the confused stares of passing pedestrians. Her carefully curated influencer image was disintegrating in real time. But Darius was not crying. He was leaning heavily against a large stone planter, his chest heaving as he frantically tapped on his shattered smartphone screen. His fingers were bleeding slightly from the cracked glass, but he ignored the pain driven by pure adrenaline-fueled panic. He was not calling a criminal defense attorney. He was not calling my father. I knew exactly what he was doing, because the iPad resting securely inside my leather briefcase suddenly vibrated with a high-priority digital alert. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the tablet. The screen illuminated with a string of automated security notifications I had programmed weeks ago. Darius was attempting to execute an emergency failsafe. He was trying to trigger a backdoor cryptocurrency transfer, attempting to drain whatever hidden offshore slush funds he thought I had missed, desperately trying to secure enough untraceable cash to flee the jurisdiction. He really thought he was smarter than me. That was his fatal flaw. My family always mistook my silence for ignorance. I unlocked my iPad, bypassed his pathetic secondary firewall with a single automated script I had written over my morning coffee, and permanently locked his offshore wallet. Then I adjusted my grip on the tablet and walked confidently toward the revolving doors. I pushed through the glass panels and stepped out into the blinding Atlanta sunlight. The heat radiating off the pavement was intense, accompanied by the loud, chaotic symphony of city traffic and honking horns. As soon as my heels clicked against the concrete sidewalk, Darius snapped his head up. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me. The notification of his failed cryptocurrency transfer must have just popped up on his broken screen. The sheer desperation completely broke his remaining sanity. He let out a visceral, guttural scream that sounded more animal than human. "You piece of garbage!" he roared, abandoning his phone on the planter and charging directly at me. He lunged forward with his hands outstretched, aiming straight for my throat. The two security guards who had escorted them out immediately tensed up, reaching for their utility belts to intercept him. "Stand down," I commanded sharply, raising my left hand to halt the guards. "Let him come." The guards hesitated but followed my orders, stepping back just enough to give me space while keeping their hands ready. Darius closed the distance between us, his face contorted in absolute rage. He stopped mere inches from me, towering over my frame, his chest heaving violently. He raised his fists fully, intending to strike me down right there on the busy sidewalk. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply looked up into his manic eyes with an expression of complete, terrifying boredom. "If you touch me, Darius," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, "the assault charge will be the absolute least of your legal problems. Look at this screen." I calmly raised the iPad, holding the glowing display squarely between us. Darius froze. His fists remained clenched in the air, but his eyes darted downward to the screen. The encrypted financial ledger I had displayed was entirely decrypted. It showed an intricate, undeniable map of every single illegal transaction he had ever authorized, completely stripped of its protective digital coding. "You spent the last 2 years parading around our family dinners demanding respect because you were a visionary tech billionaire," I said, making sure my voice carried over the noise of the traffic so Chantel could hear every single word from her bench. "You mocked my auditing career. You called me a glorified calculator. You told everyone my job was meaningless. Let me show you exactly what my meaningless job can uncover." I tapped the screen, opening a deep diagnostic file. "I did not just freeze your bank accounts, Darius. I conducted a total forensic audit of your entire digital infrastructure. I bypassed your laughably cheap commercial encryption software in less than 12 minutes. I breached your main server network. And do you know what I found when I opened your highly guarded source code repository?" Darius swallowed hard. The furious red flush in his cheeks rapidly faded into a sickly pale gray. "I found absolutely nothing," I continued, my words cutting into him like surgical steel. "There is no code. There is no revolutionary application. You do not even have a single software engineer on your payroll. Your entire multi-million-dollar tech startup consists of a flashy landing page, a few artificial intelligence-generated mock-ups, and a completely fabricated employee roster. You are not a software developer. You are a fraud." Chantel stopped crying. She slowly lifted her head from her hands, staring at her husband with an expression of horrifying realization. Darius opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was completely gone. He could only produce a weak, trembling gasp. "But a fake tech company still needs capital to look legitimate," I said, taking a deliberate step forward, forcing him to take a weak step backward. I tapped the screen again, bringing up a massive web of offshore wire transfers. "The venture capital seed money that my father supposedly invested in you did not come from a legitimate equity firm. It came directly from the South Atlanta underground gambling syndicate." Darius began to shake. His knees visibly buckled under the weight of the truth. I mapped every single dollar, I explained, meticulously, refusing to grant him even a second of mercy. "You were managing illegal sports betting payouts, underground poker room profits, and localized extortion money. You were taking millions of dollars in dirty, blood-soaked cash from violent criminals. But those criminals needed a way to clean their cash before it hit the mainstream banking system. They needed a wash cycle, and that is exactly where my mother came into the picture." Chantel gasped loudly from the bench, her hand flying over her mouth. "My mother," she whispered in shock. "Yes, Chantel. Your precious, perfect mother, I said without breaking eye contact with Darius. Yvonne used her prestigious, highly respected, tax-exempt charity foundation as the primary shell company. The gambling syndicate donated the dirty money to her charity under the guise of anonymous philanthropic grants. Then, Yvonne took that exact same dirty money and legally invested it directly into your fake tech startup as clean, untraceable venture capital. You are not a CEO. You are just a highly disposable money mule for the mob and my parents. I watched the final pieces of his massive ego completely shatter. Darius was no longer the arrogant man who had mocked my thrift store dress the night before. He was a hollow, terrified shell. He finally realized his actual place in the Sterling family dynamic. My parents never respected him. They never believed in his business acumen. They just needed a useful idiot to take the fall if the federal government ever came knocking. And now the federal government was kicking the door entirely off the hinges. Please, Darius whimpered. The anger was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate begging. Kiara, please. The syndicate will kill me. If the money is gone, they will kill me before I even make it to a jail cell. You have to unlock the crypto wallet. Just give me enough to disappear. I will leave the country. You will never see me again. I swear on my life. I looked at this man who had actively participated in my emotional abuse for years. I thought about the sheer arrogance he displayed while spending my stolen inheritance on velvet blazers and private tables at exclusive nightclubs. I thought about how easily he smiled while my father told me I was completely unloved in front of hundreds of people. I slowly lowered the iPad and slid it back into my leather briefcase. I fastened the brass clasps with a firm, satisfying click. I do not negotiate with money launderers, I said coldly. I casually pulled back the crisp sleeve of my suit jacket and checked the face of my silver wristwatch. It was exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. The timing was absolutely perfect. I looked back up at his tear-streaked face. The federal agents are raiding your secondary server farm in exactly 4 minutes, I said calmly. And they are not just bringing financial auditors, they are bringing the organized crime division. You might want to beat the traffic. Right on cue, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo in the distance. The sound rapidly multiplied, bouncing off the glass skyscrapers of Midtown Atlanta, growing louder and more intense with every passing second. Darius turned his head toward the sound, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing horror. The sirens were coming from the exact direction of his hidden office space. I turned my back on both of them. I walked smoothly back toward the revolving glass doors of my building, leaving them standing on the blistering concrete sidewalk to face the total, inescapable destruction they had built for themselves. I walked back into the cool lobby of the Paramount Tower, leaving my sister and brother-in-law on the unforgiving pavement outside. The wail of the police sirens had already faded into the general hum of the city traffic. I took the private elevator back up to my penthouse, the smooth ascent offering a brief moment of silence. I poured myself a glass of iced water from the kitchen, walked over to my velvet sofa and turned on the massive television. I flipped the channel to the primary local Atlanta news station. I fully expected to see bright red breaking news banners flashing across the bottom of the screen. I expected to see live helicopter footage of the downtown server farm being raided by federal agents. I expected to see shaky smartphone footage of Darius being escorted into the back of an unmarked black government vehicle in handcuffs. But there was absolutely nothing. The noon broadcast came and went, entirely dominated by trivial local interest stories, high school sports highlights, and extended weather updates. 1 o'clock passed with a segment about a new restaurant opening in the suburbs. 2 o'clock passed with a panel discussion about property taxes. The absolute silence on the television screen was deeply unnatural. A massive federal raid on a prominent, highly funded tech startup located in the middle of the bustling financial district should have been explosive headline news across the entire state. That was the exact moment I realized the terrifying, suffocating extent of my father's political power. Desmond Sterling was not just a wealthy commercial real estate developer running for the office of the mayor. He was the heavily entrenched spider sitting at the center of a massive complex web of municipal corruption, traded favors, and financial influence. He had spent the last 2 decades meticulously funneling stolen trust fund money into the campaign coffers of city council members, police commissioners, and media executives. As soon as he received the frantic phone call from Darius about the raid, Desmond must have immediately activated that dark network. He traded future political favors, pulled heavy strings, and threatened corporate reputations to enforce a total media blackout on the raid. He knew he could not permanently stop the federal indictment against Darius, but he could delay the public relations fallout long enough to secure his mayoral election next month. However, my father did not just bury the truth. He actively replaced it with a vicious lie. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass coffee table with a relentless stream of urgent notifications. They were not frantic text messages from panicking family members anymore. They were automated digital alerts. I had set up comprehensive media tracking software for the Sterling family name several months ago to monitor his political campaign. Now my secure email inbox was flooding with links to prominent Atlanta gossip blogs, local political news sites, and highly followed social media accounts. I clicked on the top link, which directed me to the most read political blog in the city. The bold black headline made my blood run instantly cold. Mayoral candidate Desmond Sterling, heartbroken over estranged daughters, tragic mental breakdown, and cruel extortion attempt. I read through the lengthy article, my eyes scanning the vicious, perfectly crafted, completely fabricated narrative. The anonymous source, clearly a highly paid crisis public relations firm, hired directly by my father's campaign manager, painted a devastatingly false picture of my life. The article claimed that I had recently suffered a severe psychotic break, triggered by extreme professional stress and a deep-seated lifelong jealousy of my younger sister. The polished narrative completely weaponized my natural introversion, claiming my quiet nature was actually a long-standing symptom of severe psychological disturbance. The article explicitly stated that I had illegally hacked into the family financial accounts during an episode of sheer unhinged delusion. It claimed I had locked the trust funds in a deranged attempt to extort millions of dollars from my loving parents in order to secretly fund a lavish hidden lifestyle. They even included several fabricated quotes from unnamed family friends expressing their deep sorrow over my rapidly declining mental state. One fake quote read, "Kiara always struggled to fit in, but Desmond and Yvonne never stopped loving her. It is an absolute tragedy to see her attack the people who tried to save her." It was a masterful, ruthless, completely sociopathic spin. Desmond was preemptively destroying my credibility before I even had the chance to speak to the press. By publicly branding me as a mentally unstable extortionist, he was ensuring that when I finally stepped forward to tell the truth about the stolen trust fund, the general public would completely dismiss my valid claims as the paranoid delusions of a sick woman. But the public character assassination was only the very first phase of his aggressive counterattack. Desmond knew perfectly well that my greatest weapon was not just the unvarnished truth, but my professional authority. As a licensed federal forensic auditor, my words carried heavy legal weight in any courtroom. He knew he had to sever my professional lifelines to completely isolate me and strip me of my credibility. At 3:30 in the afternoon, a high-priority email arrived in my secure corporate inbox. The sender was Richard, the senior managing partner at my elite auditing firm. He had been a mentor to me for years, guiding me through the complexities of federal financial law. But the subject line of his email simply and coldly read, "Urgent notice of administrative leave." I opened the email, my jaw clenching tight. Richard explained that the firm's executive board had just received a formal emergency injunction from the State Board of Accountancy in Atlanta. Desmond had personally filed a massive ethical complaint against me through his high-powered legal team. The complaint formally accused me of severe breaches of fiduciary duty, illegal corporate data manipulation, and utilizing restricted federal auditing tools to conduct a malicious personal vendetta against my own family members. Richard wrote that due to the extreme political weight of the sterling name, the intense media scrutiny suddenly surrounding my mental health, and the sheer severity of the legal allegations, the state board had absolutely no choice but to open an immediate intensive investigation into my professional conduct. Consequently, the firm was legally required to place me on an indefinite, entirely unpaid suspension pending the final outcome of the government inquiry. Furthermore, my access to the firm's private servers, client files, and federal financial databases was to be revoked immediately. I quickly minimized the email application and tried to log into the secure corporate portal to download a local backup copy of the Darius audit file just in case they tried to delete it. But my administrative credentials had already been completely wiped from the system directory. My laptop screen flashed a stark red unauthorized access warning. I was completely locked out of my own professional network. Everything I had worked for over the last decade was suspended with a single phone call. I sat alone in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, temporarily stripped of my hard-earned career, publicly branded as a dangerous lunatic, and completely cut off from my professional colleagues. My father was systematically trying to crush me into total submission. He wanted me to feel entirely powerless, desperate, and alone. He wanted me to panic, to cry, and to come crawling back to the family mansion on my hands and knees, begging for his forgiveness and signing away my birthright just to make the public nightmare stop. I stared at the red error message on my computer screen. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I only felt a deep, absolute certainty. Desmond thought he was playing a game of political chess. He thought he could outmaneuver the truth with expensive public relations firms and corrupt favors. He did not realize that I was absolutely not playing politics. I was playing precise forensic mathematics, and mathematics did not care about his mayoral campaign. Suddenly, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. The screen illuminated the dimming living room. A single text message had arrived. It was from my mother, Yvonne. She had never once texted me first in my entire 32 years of life, unless she needed me to do something for her. I leaned forward and tapped the screen to read the message. It was short, cold, and dripping with her signature brand of toxic condescension. Meet me at the Oakmont Country Club at 5 o'clock. Let us end this before you embarrass yourself further. I stared at the words glowing on the digital screen. She thought she had entirely won. She thought the massive smear campaign and the professional suspension had successfully broken my spirit. She was calling me to the country club to deliver the final blow, to offer me a pathetic settlement in exchange for my permanent silence. I locked my phone, stood up from the velvet sofa, and walked toward my expansive walk-in closet. I needed to select the perfect suit for my mother's ultimate downfall. I carefully pulled a tailored navy blazer from its hanger, completely ready for war. The heavy fabric of the tailored navy blazer felt like a suit of armor as I slipped it over my shoulders. I checked my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of my closet. I did not look like a woman who had just been publicly branded as a lunatic. I did not look like a woman who had just lost her highly prestigious career. I looked exactly like what I was, a federal forensic auditor preparing to close the most important case of her entire life. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to the Oakmont Country Club gave me ample time to mentally map out the conversation ahead. Oakmont was the undisputed crown jewel of the Atlanta Black elite. It was a sprawling, hyper-exclusive sanctuary where multi-million-dollar political deals were struck over 18 holes of pristine golf and endless glasses of imported champagne. Securing a membership required not just exorbitant wealth, but the right family name, the right social connections, and the right polished image. My parents had spent 2 decades meticulously curating their public persona to entirely dominate this exact space. I handed my keys to the valet, ignoring the slightly confused look he gave my modest sedan, which was parked directly between a Bentley and a brand new Porsche. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors and stepped into the main dining room. The atmosphere was thick with old money soft jazz and quiet judgmental whispers. High society matrons wearing oversized pearls and designer silk dresses sat at tables draped in crisp white linen, It did not take me long to spot my mother. Yvonne was seated at a prime table in the center of the outdoor veranda, perfectly positioned so that anyone walking through the club would see her. She was dressed in an immaculate powder blue Chanel suit, her hair styled to absolute perfection. She was sipping a glass of sparkling water, looking every bit the elegant, long-suffering matriarch. As soon as she saw me approaching the table, the performance instantly began. Yvonne gasped loudly, placing a delicate hand over her chest. She stood up from her chair, her face contorting into a perfect mask of tragic, overwhelming maternal relief. Several wealthy patrons at the neighboring tables immediately stopped their conversations and turned to watch the spectacle. "Oh, my sweet girl," Yvonne cried out, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry across the veranda. "Kiara, you came. I've been so incredibly worried about you." She rushed forward and threw her arms around me, pulling me into a tight, crushing embrace. To the wealthy onlookers sipping their mimosas, it looked like a beautiful, touching picture of a mother forgiving her deeply troubled, mentally unstable daughter. But as she pressed her perfectly powdered cheek against mine, her voice dropped into a venomous, hateful whisper that only I could hear. "You stupid, ungrateful little girl," she hissed into my ear, her manicured fingers digging painfully into the back of my navy blazer. "You really thought you could outsmart us? Smile and sit down before I have security throw you out." She pulled back from the hug, wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of her eye, and offered me a warm, loving smile for the audience. I kept my face perfectly neutral, pulling out the chair opposite hers and taking a seat. The waiter appeared, instantly sensing the tension, but too well trained to acknowledge it. I ordered a simple black coffee. Yvonne waited until he retreated before the maternal mask entirely vanished. Her eyes turned cold and calculating. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white linen tablecloth. "I hope you enjoyed your little temper tantrum this morning," she said, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "Because the fun is officially over. Richard from your auditing firm called Desmond an hour ago. He confirmed your indefinite suspension. You are locked out of your network. Your career is completely finished. And by tomorrow morning, every single news outlet in this city will be running the story about your tragic psychological collapse." I remained completely silent, letting her lay all her cards on the table. My silence only fueled her profound arrogance. "You were always so foolish, Kiara," she continued, picking up her crystal glass of water. "You never understood how the real world works. You think a few locked bank accounts and a federal audit report are going to stop us. Desmond is a sterling. He has been playing golf with the regional director of the Federal Reserve Bank for 15 years. He has the police chief on speed dial. He owns the judges in this district. Whatever temporary financial freeze you manage to trigger will be quietly lifted by a federal judge on Monday morning." She set her glass down and looked at me with deep, unmistakable disgust. It was the exact same look she had given me my entire life. "I tried to groom you for this world," she said, her voice dripping with misplaced resentment. "I really did. But you were always a disappointment. Look at you. Even now, sitting in a luxury country club, you look like a tired, miserable secretary. You were always too dark, too quiet, and too stubborn to survive in high society. You refused to network. You refused to dress properly. You refused to let me fix your hair. You never had the charm or the bright complexion of your sister. Chantel knows how to play the game. You just sit in the corner holding on to your bitter little grudges, completely consumed by your own jealousy." The casual cruelty of her words was astounding but not surprising. Colorism and emotional neglect were the twin pillars of her parenting style. She had spent 32 years treating my darker skin and introverted personality as a personal insult to her carefully manufactured upper-class image. "You do not belong here," Kiara Yvonne stated flatly, as if delivering an absolute scientific fact. "You have never belonged in this family. And now you have proven that you are a genuine threat to our legacy. So we are going to permanently remove you from the equation." Yvonne unclasped her expensive designer handbag and reached inside. She pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope and placed it firmly on the table between us. She slowly slid it across the linen cloth until it stopped right in front of my hands. "Inside that envelope is a certified cashier's check for $1 million, she said, her eyes locking onto mine. I looked down at the envelope. my expression remaining completely unchanged. Take the money, Yvonne commanded. Take it and move to California. Or New York. I really do not care where you go as long as you leave Atlanta tonight. You will contact the Federal Financial Task Force and officially retract your audit findings. You will claim that you manipulated the data during a severe manic episode. You will drop the federal holds on the family trust fund. And you will sign the permanent transfer of power document over to your father. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with an air of absolute victory. If you do this, Desmond will quietly withdraw his legal complaint with the State Board of Accountancy. We will issue a public statement saying you are seeking private medical treatment in a luxury facility out of state, and we will never speak to you again. You get to keep your freedom and $1 million. If you refuse, Desmond will have you permanently disbarred, sued for corporate defamation, and possibly committed to a psychiatric ward by a judge who owes him a massive political favor. You will never beat the sterling name in this town. We hold all the power. She took a slow, victorious sip of her sparkling water. Take the check, Kiara. It is the absolute best offer you will ever get. I looked at the envelope. $1 million. It was a pathetic, insulting fraction of the massive real estate empire they had been quietly stealing from me for the last decade. They had used my inheritance to buy their social status, to fund my father's mayoral campaign, and to finance the lavish lifestyle that Chantel constantly flaunted in my face. Now, they were trying to buy my permanent silence with pocket change, convinced that my temporary professional suspension had successfully broken my spirit. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of the emotional devastation Yvonne so desperately wanted to see. I slowly unbuttoned the front of my navy blazer. I reached into the interior breast pocket and pulled out a small, cheap, prepaid burner phone. The dark plastic casing looked entirely out of place sitting on the pristine white tablecloth next to the crystal glasses and silver cutlery. I set the burner phone down right next to the envelope containing the $1 million check. Yvonne stopped smiling. Her eyes darted from the envelope to the cheap plastic phone, her perfectly arched eyebrows furrowing in deep confusion. "What is that?" she asked, her voice losing a fraction of its confident edge. "Are you trying to record me?" I leaned forward, mirroring her earlier posture, and rested my arms on the table. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, completely stripping away the power dynamic she thought she controlled. "I do not need to record you, Yvonne," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical register that commanded absolute authority. "You fundamentally misunderstand the situation. You think this is a political negotiation. You think you can bribe your way out of federal financial crimes with a check and a few empty threats about corrupt judges." I tapped my index finger twice against the plastic casing of the burner phone. "I gave the number to this specific phone to your charity director earlier this morning," I explained slowly, ensuring she absorbed the absolute gravity of my words. "I told her to use it only in the event of a catastrophic legal emergency." Yvonne's confident posture instantly stiffened. The color began to drain from her flawlessly made-up face. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that I did not just audit Darius," I said. "I audited you. Every single fraudulent wire transfer, every offshore account, every time you used your tax-exempt charity foundation to wash dirty gambling money for the South Atlanta Syndicate. I mapped it all, Yvonne, and I gave the entire dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation 3 months ago." Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but the cheap plastic burner phone suddenly vibrated violently against the table, emitting a sharp, jarring ringtone that shattered the quiet elegance of the country club veranda. The cheap synthetic melody of the burner phone continued to loop, completely violating the hushed, refined atmosphere of the Oakmont Country Club. Several heads turned in our direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and aristocratic annoyance. Yvonne stared at the vibrating piece of black plastic as if it were a live grenade resting on the white linen tablecloth. But her lifelong instinct to maintain her social superiority quickly overrode her initial flash of panic. She forced a harsh, patronizing laugh, shaking her head as she leaned back in her chair. She intentionally ignored the ringing phone, refusing to give it the power to interrupt her narrative. "You are bluffing, Kiara," she said, her voice dripping with forced confidence. "You are being incredibly dramatic today, but you are still just bluffing. A 400-page dossier. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do you honestly think throwing around a few intimidating government acronyms is going to scare me into submission? She pushed the white envelope containing the $1 million check a few inches closer to my side of the table. You have been watching far too many television shows, Yvonne continued, waving her hand dismissively at the ringing phone. Let us pretend for a single ridiculous moment that you actually managed to submit a financial report to a federal agency. Do you genuinely believe anything will come of it? Desmond plays golf with the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service. He is on a first-name basis with half of the federal judges in this district. We have been audited before Kiara. We have faced government regulators before. And do you know what happens? Desmond makes a few phone calls, he writes a few generous campaign contribution checks, and the auditors quietly pack up their briefcases and disappear. We buy them off. We always buy them off. I did not move. I just sat there watching her desperately try to rebuild the walls of her collapsing reality. You cannot bribe an algorithm, Yvonne, I said, my voice cutting through her arrogant delusion with surgical precision. The burner phone finally stopped ringing. The sudden silence on the veranda felt heavy and suffocating. Yvonne smirked, clearly taking the silence as a sign of her own victory. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. I wanted her to look directly into my eyes so she could see the absolute terrifying certainty of her own destruction. This is not a local zoning board dispute, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly even and clinical. This is a Title 18 federal racketeering investigation. I did not just flag a minor tax anomaly. I did not just report a suspicious deduction. I handed the federal government the fully decrypted ledgers for the Cayman Islands shell companies you set up under Chantel's maiden name. I gave them the specific routing numbers for the offshore trusts. I gave them the exact dates, times, and locations of every single meeting you had with the South Atlanta gambling syndicate bosses. The meetings you disguised as VIP donor dinners for your charity galas. Yvonne's smirk completely vanished. Her perfectly arched eyebrows twitched. You think Desmond can just write a check to make this go away? I asked, allowing a small cold smile to touch my lips. The task force that is currently dismantling your empire does not report to anyone in Atlanta. They report directly to the Department of Justice in Washington. They have been watching your charity foundation for 6 months, silently waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. My forensic audit was that final piece. I gave them the undeniable mathematical proof that you have been laundering millions of dollars of illicit gang money through a tax-exempt philanthropic organization. She opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. She reached for her crystal glass of sparkling water, her manicured fingers trembling so violently that the ice cubes clinked loudly against the sides of the glass. I tracked every single dollar. I continued, relentlessly refusing to give her a single second to breathe. I tracked the money you stole from my blind trust to purchase this country club membership. I tracked the funds you siphoned to pay for Desmond's mayoral campaign advertisements. I even tracked the $75,000 you wired to a private crisis management firm this morning to publish that fake news article about my supposed mental breakdown. You left a digital paper trail so incredibly wide and arrogant that it almost insulted my intelligence as an auditor. Yvonne brought the water glass to her lips, but she could not take a sip. Her eyes were wide with a growing, inescapable horror. The political armor she had worn for her entire life was entirely useless against the cold, hard reality of federal financial mathematics. "You are my daughter," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its former venom. It was replaced by a pathetic, hollow disbelief. "How could you do this to your own family? You lost the right to call me your daughter at midnight last night," I replied flatly. "When you stood in that mansion and told a room full of strangers that you never loved me, you severed the very last tie holding my silence in place. You thought you were putting me in my place. In reality, you were just signing your own federal indictment." Before she could respond, the cheap plastic burner phone sitting on the table violently vibrated to life again. The synthetic ringtone pierced the quiet air for a second time. I gestured casually toward the phone. "Pick it up, Yvonne. Your charity director is incredibly persistent. I imagine she is quite panicked right now." Yvonne stared at the ringing phone. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a massive cliff, realizing the ground beneath her feet was actively crumbling away. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She slowly set her crystal water glass down, though she kept her trembling fingers wrapped tightly around the stem. With her free hand, she reached out and picked up the burner phone. She pressed the green accept button and slowly brought the plastic device to her ear. She did not say hello. She did not say a single word. Even from across the table, I could hear the sheer, unadulterated hysteria radiating from the tiny speaker. The charity director was not just panicked, she was hyperventilating, her voice breaking into loud, uncontrollable sobs. "Yvonne, where are you?" The director screamed, the audio distorting sharply. "You need to get to the headquarters right now. There are dozens of unmarked government vans surrounding the entire building. Federal agents are everywhere. They kicked the front doors off the hinges. They have federal warrants. They are ripping the computer servers out of the walls. They are loading boxes of our private financial records into trucks." Yvonne sat perfectly still, her eyes locked onto mine, completely paralyzed by the horrific audio playing against her ear. "They froze all the foundation bank accounts," the director continued to scream. "The agents just handcuffed the chief financial officer in the middle of the lobby. They are asking for you, Yvonne. They are asking for all the records related to the South Atlanta grants." "What is happening? Yvonne, please say something." Yvonne could not say anything. The profound shock completely short-circuited her nervous system. Her pristine, highly controlled socialite facade violently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Her hand suddenly went entirely limp. The crystal glass she was holding slipped from her weakened fingers. It plummeted toward the table, hitting the edge of the heavy marble surface before crashing onto the stone patio floor. The glass shattered violently, sending sharp crystal shards and sparkling water exploding across the pristine white ground. Several women at the adjacent tables gasped loudly, jumping back in their seats. Waiters immediately rushed forward, holding white towels, but stopped dead in their tracks when they saw the look of absolute terror painted across Yvonne's face. The burner phone slipped from her ear, dropping onto the linen tablecloth. The frantic, sobbing voice of the charity director continued to echo from the speaker, begging for answers that Yvonne would never be able to provide. I slowly stood up from my chair and buttoned the front of my tailored navy blazer. I looked down at my mother. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving as if she were actively drowning. The perfectly styled hair, the powder blue Chanel suit, the expensive pearls. None of it mattered anymore. She was just a common criminal who had finally run out of time. I reached out and picked up the white envelope containing the $1 million check. I casually tossed it directly onto her lap. "Keep the money, Yvonne," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, making sure it was the very last thing she heard before I walked away. "You are going to need a phenomenal criminal defense attorney. And frankly, with all your accounts currently frozen by the federal government, this check is probably going to bounce by tomorrow morning." I turned my back on her and walked confidently across the veranda. I did not look back at the shattered glass. I did not look back at the wealthy patrons whispering in shock. I walked straight through the mahogany doors of the Oakmont Country Club, leaving the burning ruins of my mother's high society empire entirely behind me. The drive back to the Paramount Tower was incredibly peaceful. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete canyons of the city. For the first time in my entire life, my shoulders felt entirely light. The suffocating weight of the Sterling family expectations had been completely lifted. They were no longer untouchable titans of industry and politics. They were just desperate criminals drowning in the consequences of their own absolute greed. I pulled into my secure parking garage, took the private elevator up to my penthouse, and unlocked the heavy steel door. I fully expected to spend the rest of the evening in quiet solitude, reviewing the final confirmation emails from the federal task force. But as soon as I placed my keys on the kitchen counter, the secure video intercom mounted on my living room wall began to chime urgently. I walked over and tapped the screen. The face of Marcus, the head building security guard, appeared. He looked incredibly stressed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Miss Sterling, I am so sorry to bother you again," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "Your sister is down here in the lobby. She bypassed the outer gate by following a resident vehicle inside. She is refusing to leave, She is crying hysterically and screaming that she will call the local news stations and make a massive scene if you do not let her up. I have my hand on my radio. Say the word and I will have the police drag her out of here in handcuffs. I stared at the security feed. I could see Chantel pacing wildly in the background, her face buried in her hands. Do not call the police, Marcus, I said calmly. Send her up. I will handle this permanently. I unlocked the elevator access and walked back to the center of my living room. A minute later, the heavy doors slid open. Chantel practically fell out of the elevator cabin. She looked absolutely destroyed. The luxurious, perfect influencer facade had been entirely violently stripped away. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained, her custom hair extensions were tangled. Thick black mascara tracked heavily down her cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. As soon as she saw me standing there, she collapsed onto the hardwood floor. She dropped to her knees, crawled across the room, and aggressively grabbed the fabric of my suit trousers. "Kiara, please!" She sobbed loudly, burying her face against my legs. "Please, you have to help me. You have to save me." I had absolutely no idea. I swear to God, I did not know what Darius was doing. I looked down at my younger sister, the golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life mocking my clothes, my career, and my very existence. Now she was groveling on my floor, completely willing to throw her own husband into the fire to save her own skin. "Get up, Chantel," I commanded, stepping back to break her grip on my clothes. "Stop acting like a child." She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "You have to tell the federal agents that I had nothing to do with it," she pleaded, her hands shaking violently. "Darius lied to me. He told me the business was legitimate. He told me the venture capital was real. He used me, Kiara. He is a monster. He manipulated me just like he manipulated Mom and Dad. I am a victim in all of this. You have to protect me." I crossed my arms over my chest, my face remaining an impassive, completely unreadable mask. "You are a victim," I asked, my voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You spent the last 2 years flying on private jets, wearing custom diamonds, and buying luxury real estate with money stolen directly from my trust fund. You did not ask a single question about where the millions of dollars were coming from because you did not care." Chantel desperately shook her head, tears flying from her face. "No, you do not understand. I am your sister. We are family." She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a frantic, pleading whisper. "Kiara, we are Black women. We have to stick together. It is us against the world. You know exactly how the justice system treats Black men in this country. You cannot let them send Darius to a federal penitentiary. The system will completely destroy him. You cannot do that to our community. You cannot do that to me." I stared at her in absolute disgust. The sheer audacity of her manipulation was staggering. "Do not ever try to weaponize our race to cover up your sociopathic greed," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made her flinch. "You did not care about Black sisterhood when you were mocking my dark skin at family dinners. You did not care about the community when you and your husband were laundering millions of dollars for violent gambling syndicates that actively destroy our neighborhoods in South Atlanta. You are not a victim of the system, Chantel. You are the predator. And you are only crying right now because you finally got caught." Chantel let out a sharp, panicked gasp. "But I did not do anything illegal. I just spent the money. I did not sign the fraudulent transfers. I did not move the charity funds. Darius did all of that. He kept me completely in the dark." I slowly walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the coffee table. I unclasped the brass locks and pulled out my tablet. "You always thought I was stupid, Chantel," I said, tapping the screen to unlock the encrypted drive. "You thought because I was quiet I was oblivious. But my silence was just me gathering data. When I breached your husband's server network, I did not just download the financial ledgers. I downloaded the internal communication logs, the text messages, the secure emails, and the recorded phone calls." Chantel's frantic crying suddenly stopped. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. "What phone calls?" she whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. I tapped a specific audio file on the screen and turned the volume all the way up. The digital recording began to play clearly through the tablet speakers. It was Darius's voice, first sounding stressed and annoyed, The bank is demanding a secondary signature for the commercial loan collateral, he said on the recording. They need Kiara's authorization because the trust is the primary guarantor. If we do not get her signature by tomorrow, the South Atlanta guys are going to break my legs. Then another voice responded. It was Chantel's voice, clear, arrogant, and dripping with malicious intent. Just give me the damn papers, Darius. I will sign her name. Her signature is incredibly easy to forge. She is too busy playing with her little calculators to ever notice a missing property deed. Kiara is a complete idiot. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy and absolutely devastating. Chantel stared at the tablet in my hand, her mouth hanging open in sheer horror. She was completely paralyzed. The lie she had just tried to sell me about being an innocent, oblivious victim was entirely destroyed by her own recorded words. You did not just spend the money, Chantel, I said, tossing the tablet onto the sofa. You actively forged my legal signature on federal loan documents. You knowingly committed wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. You helped Darius pledge my real estate assets as collateral for illegal syndicate loans. I took a deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. In the eyes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are not a poor, manipulated wife, I explained methodically. You are a fully indicted co-conspirator. I handed that audio file over to the federal prosecutor 3 days ago. When they finish raiding your husband's office, they are coming straight to your house. You are going to federal prison right next to him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The absolute certainty of her impending incarceration shattered the last remaining pieces of her sanity. Her fear instantly mutated into a wild, cornered, rabid fury. You are a monster! Chantel screamed at the top of her lungs, her face turning a deep, violently angry red. She clenched her fists, her body shaking with pure hatred. You destroyed this family. You ruined my life. Mom and Dad were entirely right about you. You do not belong with us. You never belonged with us. You are just a bitter, jealous, unloved orphan. She stood there panting, expecting her vicious insult to finally break my composure, expecting me to show some sign of emotional damage. I looked at my sister. I looked at the ruined designer dress, the smeared makeup, and the complete destruction of her false superiority. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for her. You are half right, I replied smoothly. I walked past her, opened my front door wide, and gestured toward the hallway. Get out of my house, I said. Chantel glared at me with an intense, burning hatred, but she had absolutely no ammunition left. She stomped out of the apartment, her ruined heels clicking harshly against the floor. As soon as she crossed the threshold, I slammed the heavy steel door shut behind her, the loud metallic crash echoing with a profound sense of absolute finality. I locked the deadbolt and walked back into the living room, leaving the remnants of my sister's shattered ego out in the hallway. I did not have the luxury of time to dwell on her pathetic, desperate display. The federal gears were already turning rapidly, and I knew my father was not the type of man to sit quietly while his massive political empire burned to the ground. Desmond Sterling was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always make one final, highly calculated lunge for the throat. My prediction was proven absolutely correct the very next morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, a formal process server knocked loudly on the door of my penthouse. He handed me a thick manila envelope heavily stamped with the official red seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. It was a mandatory summons for a closed-door, expedited emergency hearing scheduled for 2 o'clock that exact afternoon. Desmond had completely bypassed all standard legal procedures and waiting periods. He had aggressively utilized his extensive political connections to secure an immediate private audience with Judge Thomas Caldwell. Caldwell was a notoriously corrupt man whose entire judicial career had been heavily funded and protected by the Sterling Mayoral Campaign Action Committee. I immediately picked up my phone and called my legal counsel. I had not navigated this massive, highly dangerous financial audit without an ironclad legal strategy in place. My attorney was Valerie Rollins. She was a ruthless, brilliant, high-powered black female attorney who specialized exclusively in high-stakes federal litigation and complex trust fund law. Valerie was an absolute legend in the Atlanta legal community. She was notoriously cold, impeccably dressed, and completely immune to the aggressive political intimidation tactics that my father relied on to control the city. When I told her about the emergency hearing and the specific judge presiding over it, she did not sound worried in the slightest. She simply told me to wear a sharp suit and meet her on the courthouse steps. We met on the polished marble steps of the downtown courthouse at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon. Valerie wore a striking, perfectly tailored crimson suit that stood out starkly against the drab gray stone columns of the legal building. She carried a locked leather briefcase and offered me a single, highly confident nod. She did not ask how I was feeling emotionally. She only cared about the absolute facts of the case. We walked through the heavy security checkpoint in silence and made our way to the private, highly secure chambers on the fourth floor. Because this was a closed-door emergency, hearing the atmosphere was suffocatingly intimate. There was no jury box. There was no public gallery. There was absolutely no press allowed inside. It was a highly controlled environment designed entirely to benefit my father and shield his lies from public scrutiny. When Valerie and I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the private courtroom, Desmond was already seated at the plaintiff's table. He was accompanied by three highly paid, aggressive corporate lawyers who looked nervous and completely exhausted. Desmond himself looked entirely different from the charismatic, untouchable mayoral candidate he played on television. He had intentionally dressed down for the occasion to manipulate the narrative. He wore a slightly wrinkled gray suit, his expensive silk tie loosened to give the fabricated appearance of a man crumbling under immense personal stress. His eyes were red and puffy, though I knew he had likely rubbed them raw in the bathroom mirror just before we walked in. Yvonne was nowhere to be seen. She was undoubtedly still dealing with the catastrophic legal fallout of the federal raid on her charity foundation headquarters. As Valerie and I took our seats at the defense table, Judge Caldwell entered the room from his private chambers. He was an older, stern-faced man with a clear, undeniable bias radiating from his posture. He offered Desmond a sympathetic, highly familiar nod before sitting down at the elevated wooden bench and officially calling the emergency session to order. He completely bypassed the standard procedural formalities, looking directly at my father's legal team and asking them to present their urgent motion to lift the financial freeze on the campaign accounts. Desmond did not let his expensive corporate lawyers speak for him. He stood up slowly from his leather chair, placing his hands flat on the wooden table to steady himself. He bowed his head for a long, dramatic moment, allowing the heavy silence in the courtroom to build to an uncomfortable peak. When he finally looked up at the judge, his performance was nothing short of an absolute masterpiece. It was an Oscar-worthy display of fabricated grief, deep humiliation, and paternal heartbreak. Your Honor. Desmond began, his deep, commanding voice cracking perfectly with manufactured emotion. I come before you today, not as a mayoral candidate, and not as a businessman. I come before you as a completely broken father. I am standing in this courtroom begging for emergency judicial intervention to save my family from a nightmare I never could have imagined. He paused his speech, pulling a white linen handkerchief from his suit pocket and dabbing gently at the corners of his eyes. The judge leaned forward over the bench, completely captivated by the theatrical display. The young woman sitting across the aisle from me is my adopted daughter, Kiara, Desmond said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. My wife and I brought her into our home when she was just a small abandoned child. We gave her our prestigious family name. We provided her with an elite education. We welcomed her into high society. We loved her with every single ounce of our hearts, despite her severe lifelong emotional difficulties and her constant refusal to integrate into our family. I sat perfectly still, my posture completely rigid, my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm, while he continued to aggressively assassinate my character for the official judicial record. Over the past few months, Kiara has suffered a catastrophic psychological breakdown, Desmond told the judge, his voice echoing with fake, heavy sorrow. She has developed a deeply paranoid psychotic delusion that our family is secretly trying to harm her in her severe mental illness. She utilized her professional skills as a corporate forensic auditor to illegally hack into our private family trust fund and my mayoral campaign banking accounts. She completely froze our legitimate assets. She is currently holding our entire financial livelihood hostage, demanding millions of dollars in a deranged, vicious extortion plot to fund a hidden lifestyle she has kept secret from us. Judge Caldwell shook his head in sympathetic disbelief. He looked down at me from his elevated bench with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Desmond pressed his advantage beautifully, gripping the edges of the heavy wooden table, as if he were physically struggling to remain standing under the emotional weight of his lies. Your Honor, the mayoral election is only a few short weeks away. Desmond continued, raising his voice to convey desperate urgency. My daughter knows this fact. She timed this malicious cyber attack perfectly to destroy my political campaign and publicly humiliate the family that graciously took her in. She has already caused irreparable, devastating damage to my wife's charitable foundation through her paranoid, highly fabricated reports to federal agencies. I am begging this court to issue an immediate emergency injunction to unfreeze the campaign funds and restore our access to the family trust. Furthermore, I am formally asking the court to mandate an emergency psychiatric evaluation for Kiara. She is a profound danger to herself and to the general public. She needs to be placed in a secure medical facility before she completely destroys her own life and ruins the sterling legacy. Desmond slowly sat back down in his chair, burying his face in his hands, while his lead corporate lawyer patted his shoulder in a sickening display of false comfort. The private courtroom fell entirely silent. Judge Caldwell let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, clearly deeply moved by the fabricated tragedy presented before him. He looked down at me, his expression entirely decided before I even had the chance to utter a single syllable in my own defense. Miss Sterling, the judge, said, his tone dripping with intense judicial condescension and hostility. Given the severe documented nature of your mental health crisis and the highly illegal extortion tactics clearly outlined by your father, I am heavily inclined to grant this emergency injunction immediately. I will give your legal counsel exactly 2 minutes to offer a medical explanation for your erratic actions before I officially sign the order to unfreeze the campaign accounts and mandate your psychiatric hold. I did not flinch. I did not show a single trace of anger, panic, or fear. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Valerie. She looked back at me and offered a slight, terrifyingly sharp smile. Valerie Rollins stood up slowly from the defense table. She did not rush her movements. She smoothly adjusted the front of her crimson suit and picked up a thick, heavily sealed brown folder from the table. She completely ignored the 2-minute warning and the judge's blatantly obvious bias. Her mere physical presence commanded the entire room, instantly sucking the manufactured sympathy right out of the air and replacing it with cold, hard legal authority. Your Honor. Valerie began, her voice ringing through the private chambers with absolute chilling clarity. The defense has absolutely no medical explanation to offer this court today, because my client is in perfect psychological health. Furthermore, my client is not engaged in extortion, nor did she illegally hack into any financial accounts. The accounts in question were legally frozen by the federal government at our explicit request following a massive forensic investigation. The judge frowned deeply, clearly highly offended by her aggressive, unapologetic tone. Counselor, I strongly suggest you watch your tone in my courtroom, Caldwell warned sharply. Desmond Sterling is a highly respected public servant in this city. He just testified under oath that his adopted daughter illegally hijacked his family trust. Valerie stepped out from behind the defense table and confidently approached the center of the room. She stopped right in front of Desmond's table, looking down at the crumbling mayoral candidate with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt, before turning her sharp gaze back to the angry judge. My client is not an extortionist, Your Honor, Valerie stated loudly, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. And more importantly, my client is absolutely not his adopted daughter. She walked directly up to the elevated bench and placed the thick, sealed folder directly onto the judge's wooden desk. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the solid wood echoed like a sharp gunshot in the quiet room. Inside that folder, you will find a court-ordered, federally verified, DNA test, Valerie declared, turning her head slowly to look directly into Desmond's suddenly terrified, pale face. Along with a 32-year-old original legally binding will that completely changes the ownership of the entire Sterling empire. Judge Caldwell stared at the brown folder sitting on his desk as if it were a highly unstable explosive device. The absolute silence in the private courtroom was deafening. Desmond's expensive corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, completely blindsided by the sudden introduction of physical evidence. They had prepared for a standard psychological evaluation defense, not a massive foundational challenge to the entire Sterling family history. Caldwell slowly reached out, broke the heavy red wax seal, and opened the folder. He pulled out the first document, a certified medical laboratory report. His eyes scanned the crisp, black text. The stern, highly biased expression on his face began to rapidly dissolve, replaced by a look of profound, genuine confusion. He looked up from the paper, his gaze locking directly onto Desmond. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice stripped of its previous warmth, "this is a federally certified genetic analysis. It states with 99.9% certainty that you are the biological father of Kiara Sterling." Desmond did not answer. He simply could not answer. He gripped the edge of the wooden table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. The charismatic, untouchable mayoral candidate was entirely gone. He looked like a terrified man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, hopelessly waiting for the heavy wooden lever to be pulled. One of his highly paid corporate lawyers quickly stood up, raising his hand in a frantic, desperate attempt to regain control of the rapidly collapsing narrative. "Your Honor, we formally object to the introduction of this document. It is completely irrelevant to the emergency injunction regarding the campaign funds and the mental health hold." Valerie did not even look at the protesting lawyer. She kept her sharp eyes entirely focused on the judge. "It is the very foundation of the injunction, Your Honor," Valerie countered smoothly. "Desmond Sterling just committed egregious perjury in your courtroom. He swore under oath that my client was an abandoned child he adopted out of the goodness of his heart. That was a lie. My client is not adopted. She is the biological product of an affair between Desmond Sterling and his wife's late older sister." The corporate lawyer slowly sank back into his chair, entirely speechless. Judge Caldwell flipped to the second page in the folder, reading the heavily stamped birth certificate that had been deliberately hidden for over 3 decades. Valerie began to slowly pace the floor in front of the bench, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. 32 years ago, Yvonne Sterling's older sister was a fiercely independent, self-made commercial real estate titan, Valerie explained, her voice ringing with absolute authority. She was brilliant, highly successful, and completely immune to the toxic social climbing that defined Yvonne's life. But she made one fatal, tragic mistake. She had a brief, hidden affair with her younger sister's ambitious, highly manipulative husband. When she became pregnant with Kiara, she chose to keep the pregnancy entirely secret from the public to protect the Sterling family name from a catastrophic scandal. Desmond closed his eyes, a single drop of cold sweat rolling down the side of his face. He knew his darkest, most closely guarded secret was being permanently etched into the official judicial record. When the sister tragically passed away shortly after childbirth, Yvonne discovered the affair, and the baby. Valerie continued. A normal, rational woman would have filed for divorce immediately. But Yvonne Sterling is not a normal woman. She is a woman obsessed with wealth status and public perception. So she struck a dark, highly calculated deal with her cheating husband. They would take the baby in. They would legally claim her as a highly publicized charitable adoption. They would use Kiara to bolster Desmond's public image as a compassionate, loving family man, all while privately subjecting the child to decades of severe emotional neglect and psychological abuse. Judge Caldwell looked physically sick. The narrative of the mentally unstable daughter was completely falling apart right in front of his eyes. But why, the judge asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why would a woman agree to raise the product of her husband's affair while actively despising the child? Why not simply give her up for a closed adoption and bury the scandal entirely? Valerie offered a cold, predatory smile. She turned to face Desmond directly. "Because of the will, Your Honor, I direct your attention to the third document in the folder." Judge Caldwell flipped the page, his eyes widening as he recognized the official seal of a massive, highly prestigious federal banking institution. Yvonne's late sister was incredibly wealthy, Valerie explained, detailing the financial mechanics of the ultimate betrayal. But she was also incredibly smart. She knew exactly what kind of people Desmond and Yvonne were. She knew they were greedy, highly materialistic, and entirely untrustworthy. Before she died, she liquidated her massive real estate empire and placed every single penny of her billion-dollar fortune into a highly secure, heavily guarded blind trust. She explicitly named Kiara as the sole, undisputed beneficiary. Valerie walked back to the defense table and rested her hands on the polished wood. But a newborn baby cannot manage a massive corporate trust. The will legally dictated that the biological father, Desmond Sterling, would serve as the custodial manager of the funds until Kiara reached full adulthood. Yvonne did not force Desmond to keep Kiara out of a sense of moral obligation or maternal duty. She forced him to keep the baby because Kiara was the physical key to a billion-dollar vault. If they gave the child away, they gave the money away. The sterile courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of the judge flipping through the pages of the massive financial document. For 32 years, Desmond and Yvonne Sterling have lived a massive, elaborate lie. Valerie stated, her voice dripping with profound disgust. They used my client's inheritance to build their entire fraudulent empire. The sprawling mansion in Buckhead, the fleet of luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, the exclusive country club memberships, even the massive political war chest currently funding Desmond's mayoral campaign. Every single asset they possess was purchased using stolen money siphoned directly from Kiara's trust fund. They treated her like an unwanted parasite in her own home, constantly telling her she was worthless while secretly bleeding her dry to fund their own lavish existence. They created the golden child illusion for Chantel using Kiara's stolen birthright. Desmond tried to open his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, desperate political spin, but no words came out. His massive, carefully constructed world was actively disintegrating. Judge Caldwell looked at the final page of the document. His face went entirely pale. The legal jargon outlined a very specific, unbreakable temporal condition. "There is a specific clause in this," Will Caldwell muttered, reading the text aloud, as if he could not believe his own eyes. "The custodial management granted to the biological father shall automatically and irrevocably terminate at exactly midnight on the beneficiary's 32nd birthday. At that exact moment, full legal and financial control of the entire trust and all associated assets shall transfer exclusively to the beneficiary." Valerie nodded sharply. "Exactly, Your Honor. The midnight clause. Yesterday was my client's 32nd birthday." Desmond knew the clock was running out. He knew his entire political and financial empire was about to legally evaporate, so he threw a massive, highly publicized birthday party filled with his wealthy campaign donors. He cornered Kiara in the hallway, completely surrounded by high society elites, and attempted to use intense public pressure and emotional manipulation to force her to sign a document. Valerie reached into her briefcase and pulled out a crisp photocopy of the exact document Desmond had shoved into my chest the night before. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. The document he tried to force her to sign was a total permanent surrender of her inheritance rights, Valerie explained. He tried to trick her into signing away a billion-dollar empire under the guise of relieving her of a financial burden. When she refused to sign it, he grabbed a microphone and publicly humiliated her in front of hundreds of people. He told her she was unloved. He told her she was a burden. He tried to mentally break her into submission. But Kiara did not break. She walked out. And at exactly 12 o'clock midnight, she legally took back every single thing they had ever stolen from her. Judge Caldwell set the documents down on his desk. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the fraud. He looked down at Desmond, who was now trembling visibly in his expensive suit, his mayoral ambitions completely reduced to ash. Desmond's lawyers were completely silent, knowing any attempt to argue would result in immediate disbarment. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Caldwell said, his voice cold, hard, and utterly devoid of his former political loyalty. "You came into my courtroom, lied under oath, and attempted to use the judicial system to legally cover up a massive multi-decade financial crime against your own biological daughter." The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "I am formally denying your request for an emergency injunction to unfreeze the campaign funds. Furthermore, I am denying your highly offensive, entirely fabricated request for a psychiatric hold on this young woman." He looked directly into Desmond's terrified eyes and delivered the final devastating blow. "You have absolutely no legal standing to freeze those accounts, Mr. Sterling, because as of midnight last night, you are entirely bankrupt. You are driving a car owned by this young woman. You are spending campaign money owned by this young woman, and you are currently living in a house owned by this young woman." The judge slammed his gavel down onto the sounding block with a thunderous, resounding crack. The thunderous crack of the judge's wooden gavel echoed with absolute finality. That single sound marked the moment the Sterling family empire legally ceased to exist. Desmond did not shout. His knees gave out, collapsing heavily back into his leather chair, staring blankly ahead. His corporate lawyers immediately began packing their briefcases. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. Valerie and I walked out of the private chambers without casting a backward glance at the ruined man. We secured the legal victory, but I knew my father well enough to understand his massive ego would never allow him to surrender quietly. He was a creature born for the spotlight, and he would demand to die in it. By Friday, the pressure surrounding the mayoral campaign reached a catastrophic boiling point. Secrets from the closed-door hearing leaked into connected Atlanta political circles. Wealthy donors quietly pulled their funding, and major endorsements paused. Local media circled his headquarters. Rumors spread across social media, whispering about frozen assets and a family scandal. Desmond was bleeding political capital by the second. Desperate to seize control of the narrative, he orchestrated the most reckless public relations stunt of his career. He called for an emergency press conference at noon on Saturday in Centennial Olympic Park. He invited every major news network and mobilized his staff to bus in hundreds of loyal supporters. His strategy was clear. He was going to stand in front of the city, play the victim, and blame his plummeting poll numbers on a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by opponents. He would double down on the lie. Saturday afternoon arrived with sweltering heat. I parked my sedan a few blocks away and walked toward the gathering. The scale of the event was staggering. News helicopters circled loudly overhead. Heavy broadcast vans lined the perimeter. A sprawling wooden stage had been quickly erected, draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Giant digital screens flanked the podium, displaying his photoshopped smiling campaign portrait. I stood quietly at the back of the crowd, wearing a black trench coat and dark sunglasses, blending into the sea of distracted onlookers. At noon, the heavy bass of a patriotic campaign anthem blared through the concert-grade speakers. The crowd erupted into highly orchestrated cheers as Desmond confidently strode onto the stage. He looked absolutely perfect. He had hired a makeup artist to hide the pale pallor of his skin. He wore his tailored navy suit and a bright red silk tie. He stepped up to the acrylic podium, raised both hands to acknowledge the roaring crowd, and offered his trademark charismatic smile. But I could see the tremor in his fingers gripping the edges of the podium. "Thank you, Atlanta." Desmond began, his deep voice echoing powerfully across the sprawling park. "As many of you know, the past 48 hours have been the most challenging days of my political career, and frankly, the most challenging days of my life as a devoted family man." The crowd quieted down. The cameras zoomed in tightly on his face. "We are currently witnessing the darkest, most vicious political smear campaign in the modern history of this great city," Desmond continued. "My opponents know they cannot beat me at the ballot box, so they have resorted to cowardice. They have resorted to spreading completely fabricated rumors about my finances, my businesses, and most unforgivably, my family." He paused dramatically, shaking his head with a look of manufactured sorrow. "They are actively attempting to weaponize the tragic medical struggles of my own daughter against me." They are trying to frame me for crimes that do not exist. But I am standing here today to tell those cowards that Desmond Sterling will never back down. I will not be intimidated by lies. I am an open book and I demand transparency. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. He was a brilliant liar, but as he passionately rallied his supporters, I slowly began to walk forward. I moved purposefully through the dense crowd, sliding past cheering supporters and busy journalists. I simply glided through the gaps in the massive audience, keeping my eyes locked on the elevated stage. I bypassed the press barricades by flashing my auditor credential badge to a distracted security guard. I walked directly toward the shaded technical tent situated just to the right side of the main stage. Inside, a stressed sound engineer was frantically monitoring a complex audio mixing board, adjusting the equalizer levels for Desmond's booming microphone. I stepped quietly into the shade. The engineer jumped slightly, pulling one of his heavy monitoring headphones off his ear. "Hey, you cannot be back here," the engineer whispered sharply. "You need to leave immediately before I call the police." I did not argue with him. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I held it out toward him, my hand perfectly steady. I looked him directly in the eyes with an expression of absolute terrifying authority. "Plug this drive into the primary audio channel," I commanded quietly, my voice carrying a weight that paralyzed his initial protests. "If you value your career, you will play the single audio file on this drive right now. You are broadcasting a federal criminal. Do it." The sound engineer looked at the silver drive, then looked up at my cold, unwavering stare. He swallowed hard. The sheer intensity radiating from me completely overrode his professional protocols. With a trembling hand, he took the drive and slotted it directly into the main audio console. A small window popped up on his monitor. There was only one file clearly labeled with a single word. "Truth. Play it," I whispered. The engineer pressed the broadcast override button and clicked play. Out on the massive stage, Desmond was building toward his emotional crescendo. "And I promise you, the citizens of Atlanta, that I will always lead this city with honor, integrity, and unconditional love for." His microphone abruptly cut out. The booming echo of his voice vanished instantly from the sprawling park. Desmond tapped the microphone aggressively, assuming it was a simple technical malfunction. He looked over toward the sound tent with a flash of sharp anger crossing his face. A harsh burst of audio static suddenly blasted through the park, causing several people in the front rows to wince and cover their ears. And then a voice echoed across Centennial Park. It was not a live voice. It was a digital recording, but the audio quality was crystal clear. It was Desmond's own voice, captured perfectly during the height of his rage at my birthday party. "I told you to sign this paper," the recorded voice of Desmond yelled. "You have no right to refuse me. You deserve to know the truth. We never loved you." The entire park went dead silent. The cheering instantly evaporated. Thousands of people froze in place, completely stunned by the sheer cruelty of the words echoing from the giant speakers. Up on the stage, Desmond physically stumbled backward as if struck by a solid brick wall. The color vanished from his face. Then the recording shifted. Yvonne's cold, dismissive voice played next. "You should have realized that years ago. You are nothing but an embarrassment." The journalists in the press pit immediately began shouting frantically, pointing their heavy lenses directly at Desmond's horrified, sweating face. But the audio file was not finished. The real execution was next. The audio shifted a final time, bringing up a heavily encrypted recording I had pulled directly from Darius's hidden server network. It was a recorded phone call between Desmond and a prominent corrupt city zoning official. "I need the commercial permits for the South Atlanta properties fully approved by tomorrow morning," Desmond's recorded voice demanded. "I cannot do that, Desmond," the city official replied nervously. "The federal regulators are snooping around the charity foundation. If they look at the funding sources for these properties, they will see the money came from the blind trust. You are not the legal beneficiary of those funds." "I do not care about the federal regulators," Desmond snapped on the tape. "I control the trust until Kiara turns 32. I will transfer another $500,000 of her inheritance into your offshore Cayman account tonight. Just forge the compliant signatures and bury the paperwork before the election. I own this city. Just get it done." The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely total. A flock of pigeons scattered from the trees, but no human being dared to make a sound. Every single eye in Centennial Park was locked onto the man standing at the podium. Desmond Sterling looked out at the massive sea of voters, journalists, and campaign donors. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no words came out. His political armor, his carefully constructed public persona, and his entire billionaire legacy had just been completely, publicly, and irreversibly annihilated. The silence shattered. It started as a low, disbelieving murmur at the edges of the crowd and rapidly swelled into an absolute deafening roar of profound betrayal. The very supporters who had been cheering for him just seconds ago began throwing their expensive campaign signs onto the grass in disgust. The exclusive VIP seating area emptied almost instantly. Wealthy political donors, realizing the massive toxic liability of standing near a man currently confessing to federal financial crimes on a loudspeaker, stood up and practically sprinted toward their waiting town cars. Desmond remained entirely frozen at the podium. His hands gripped the clear acrylic edges so tightly his knuckles were bone white. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently as his eyes darted frantically across the furious sea of faces turning against him. Before he could even attempt to utter a single desperate word of damage control, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed against the wooden planks of the stage. A highly organized tactical unit of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bright yellow lettering across the back flanked him from both sides. They did not read him his rights politely behind closed doors in a private office. They executed the warrant right there under the glaring afternoon sun for the entire city to witness. A tall, broad-shouldered agent firmly grabbed Desmond's shoulder, spun him around roughly, and snapped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists. The sharp metallic click was picked up by the live microphone and broadcasted clearly across Centennial Park. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal embezzlement, and the bribery of a municipal official," the agent stated loudly, his voice carrying over the angry shouts of the crowd. From the right side of the stage, a sudden piercing shriek cut through the chaotic noise. Yvonne pushed her way past the stunned, unmoving campaign security detail. She was a complete disaster. The flawless, untouchable matriarch of Atlanta high society was entirely gone. Her expensive designer dress was torn at the hem from tripping on the metal stairs, and her perfectly styled hair was wildly disheveled, plastered to her forehead with nervous sweat. She lunged forward, but she did not run toward the federal agents taking her husband away. She ran directly toward me. I had stepped out from the shadow of the technical tent, standing completely calm at the edge of the stage. Yvonne collapsed heavily onto her knees directly in front of me on the hard wooden floorboards. She threw her arms out, her hands desperately clawing at the hem of my black trench coat. "Kiara, please," she sobbed hysterically, her face streaked with hot tears and ruined makeup. "Please stop this right now. Tell them it is a massive mistake. You have your money back. We will give you absolutely everything. We will leave the state. Please do not let them destroy us." Behind her, standing near the VIP exit ramp, was Chantel. My younger sister did not run forward to help our weeping mother. She simply stood there, completely frozen like a statue, clutching her chest. She was staring blankly into the distance as the absolute reality of her new, penniless existence finally crushed the last remaining breath from her lungs. She knew Darius was already in federal custody, and she knew she was next. I looked down at the woman groveling pathetically at my feet. I looked at the woman who had spent 32 years punishing me for a sin I did not commit, treating me like a parasite simply because my existence threatened her stolen wealth. I looked at the woman who had proudly stood in the grand foyer of a stolen mansion just days ago and told me I was completely unloved. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I felt no lingering obligation to save her from the fire she had built herself. I reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my coat, pushing her hands away with cold, calculated precision. Yvonne looked up at me, her chest heaving desperately. waiting for a single ounce of the daughterly devotion she had actively and maliciously destroyed. I adjusted my posture, stood tall, and looked her dead in the eyes. "You should have realized years ago," I said, my voice perfectly steady, projecting a quiet power that ensured she heard every single syllable over the chaotic noise of the angry crowd. "You are not entitled to my grace." Yvonne let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed forward, burying her face into her hands against the wooden stage as her entire world completely burned to the ground around her. She was finally experiencing the exact same profound, terrifying isolation she had forced upon me for my entire life. I turned my back on the screaming woman, the handcuffed, disgraced politician, and the ruined, terrified sister. I walked away from the stage, stepping smoothly through the aggressively parted crowd. The desperate journalists tried to shove heavy microphones in my face, shouting frantic questions about the trust fund and the mayoral race, but I ignored them all. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, walking confidently out of the park and onto the bustling city street. Waiting patiently at the curb was a sleek, perfectly polished black Rolls-Royce. It was the exact same luxury vehicle Desmond had proudly used to chauffeur himself around the city just 48 hours ago. Now it was legally reclaimed, registered solely under my name, and driven by a private, highly professional chauffeur hired by my new wealth management team. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me with a respectful nod. I slid onto the pristine, cool leather seat and closed the door firmly, completely sealing away the noise of the police sirens, the shouting reporters, and the remnants of my former family. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened my digital contact list. With 4 quick, methodical taps, I permanently blocked the phone numbers for Desmond, Yvonne, Chantel, and Darius. I erased them from my digital life just as thoroughly as I had erased them from my financial one. "Take me home," I told the driver quietly. The powerful engine purred to life, and the heavy car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the afternoon traffic. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and looked out the dark-tinted window. The brilliant orange and purple hues of the early evening Atlanta sunset were reflecting beautifully off the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. The city looked entirely different to me now. I was 32 years old. I had successfully reclaimed my billion-dollar empire, permanently eradicated the deep toxicity from my life, and finally taken my rightful, undisputed place in the world. The 88 missed calls on my birthday meant absolutely nothing. I had already won.